In your own backyard, local history and how to investigate it. In the new national curriculum, Key Stage 1 requires studying significant historical events, people and places in their own locality, and both Key Stage 2 and 3 both require a local history project. So understanding what's available and how to research has become really important for all teachers. So why do we want to look at the local area? Well, children can relate to their immediate surroundings, and information gathering should be a lot easier. Visits and field work are less complex to achieve, as you don't have to provide transport to get to the places of interest. Very often you can just walk to wherever you're going, and this is really helpful. As with all good teaching, what you need to do is set the aims of your project and what the learning objectives are going to be for the students. You need to define a small group of questions that you want answered, and sort these out between the children possibly. Set time limits for the work and also the size of the area to be covered. Otherwise it can be somewhat overpowering, I think. A logical place to start when you're looking at a local history project is to actually look at the school itself, particularly if it happens to be an old school that may be in a Victorian or even earlier building. And you can look at records from the school, because there should be day books going back right the way through the history, and there can be very interesting materials. Even if it's a new building, it may well be on the site of something older, and you can go back in the records and look at what went on in the past. The Clifton experience relates to a library that I worked in many years ago, which was set in an old primary school. It was a Victorian school, first started in the late 1800s, I think 1870. And it continued as a primary school until the mid-1960s, and then was turned into a public library. I decided to do some work on this because I found this really enchanting photograph from the early 1900s with some very stern looking teachers and lots of young children who were in two large classrooms which were part of our building. What this ended up as was a large exhibition, a huge quantity of materials, a reunion for over 70 ex-pupils and teachers, and a really interesting experience which then carried on to the new primary school, who did further research for the school's 150th anniversary. So from one small picture we ended up with a huge amount of local history from the school. So the sorts of people that you can ask for information about your school are your grandparents, your parents, members of local pensioners groups, lunch clubs, homes, local societies, the local history group, and local newspapers. Information is obviously held in places such as your local library, who will very often have a local history collection of their own, the local record office, newspaper archives if they happen to have one, local history groups. You can advertise in your local paper, and that will very often bring forward people who know something about the subject that you're trying to investigate. School records, local museums. There are loads of websites out there that you can look for, and Google Earth is really useful for seeing how an area changes over the years. Children in particular really love to go and actually physically look at some evidence. So some of the things that you can do are to visit local landmarks, local churches, investigate what's inside, looking at tombstones and plaques on walls. You can look at old houses, looking for the building dates. Old pubs very often have a long history, particularly if it's a main route out of London where There are coaching routes and old maps looking to see how they change over the years. You can create a picture of the area and what's been going on by creating a timeline and comparing buildings and other facilities over several points in time. You can compare pictures and maps. I know of one project which is online about Bristol, and by looking at different maps and images, you can actually see development of post-war housing estates around the outside of the city, and that, for the people who are living there, that is really fascinating. Looking at what people have written about or said about the past, it's really, really useful to collect reminiscences from older members of the community. Then look at memories in books and papers. Lots of your local history groups will have recorded interviews with people over the years. Very many people, particularly to do with World War II, have written accounts of their childhood, of being evacuees, things like that. There are also letters from people, particularly at the moment we're looking at First World War, so there are letters from people who served at the front, and then maybe a telegram saying something disastrous has happened to them, but it's all very important. You can also use things like bills, invoices, adverts, tickets, billboard posters, all sorts of things to give you a sense of what a particular place was like in the past. Bristol created something they call the Bristol Curriculum, which is taking aspects of the national curriculum but just looking at it from a Bristol perspective. It doesn't need to be just the local history. It can be any subject from the curriculum and just saying, how was that reflected in the city? And that then leads on to investigating the local history side as well. Think what subjects you could do this with, and think about in particular your local area, because there may well be specifics there which really, really you can play on and make something of. Bristol is particularly lucky in having several collections of sketches and images collected or created by people during the late 18th and into the 19th century, showing Bristol and the surrounding area. And these can be used by schools and other people in order to reflect on what a particular area was like maybe 150, 200 years ago. The collections for particularly this Breckenridge project, they tend to be held at the museum, at the Central Library and in the Record Office. They have now been digitised, which is brilliant, and are online, and so it really makes it accessible for schools to actually look at these things. And there has been some work done to provide some exemplars, some examples for schools to work on in order to make the most of the facilities available. What we've got to remember is that we're actually living through history. We think of it as the present day, but in 5 or 10 years' time, children will think that this is history because it's before they were born. So what we need to do is keep a note of what these changes are. Is the school changing? We need to keep records of all the events that are going on, take photos which tell a story, and keep any local history projects that you do, because they will be useful again in the future. So what can you do? Well, find, and if you don't have one, create an archive of material about your school and the local area. Create a display for school about the local history. Very importantly, make community links. This is just so important, and it will be very useful in all sorts of ways, not just for local history. But also think history all around. Just about everything you look at has history or has the potential for history. So don't just think about the obvious. Do a bit of lateral thinking and think what you could do to improve children's sense of history.